They always said I was too old to have an opinion about anything. For 52 years, I sat quietly in the corner while my family made decisions around me, as if I were just another piece of furniture in our little house in Tennessee. But on the day of my husband and I's funeral, when everyone expected me to stay silent one more time, I stood up and revealed the secret that would change everything they thought they knew about the man they were mourning. My name is Evangeline Thornfield, but everyone calls me Evie. I'm 78 years old, and until 3 days ago, I was married to Garrett Thornfield for what everyone in our small town of Millbrook considered a perfect marriage. People would look at us at Sunday service and whisper about how lucky Garrett was to have such a devoted wife, how I never complained, never argued, never caused any trouble. They had no idea that my silence wasn't devotion. It was survival. Garrett passed away on a Tuesday morning in October. Heart attack, the doctor said. Quick and painless. I found him in his study, slumped over the desk where he kept all his important papers. The same desk where, 20 years ago, I discovered something that would torment me for the rest of his life and beyond. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The funeral home was packed with people from all over the county. Garrett had been what you might call a pillar of the community. He owned the largest hardware store in town, served on the city council for 15 years, and donated generously to the local church. Everyone had a story about how Garrett had helped them through tough times, how he'd extended credit when money was tight, how he'd shown up with tools and materials when someone needed repairs they couldn't afford. Our children, Cordelia and Thaddeus, flew in from their lives in Nashville and Atlanta respectively. They're good kids now in their 40s with families of their own. But they've always treated me the same way their father did, with a kind of patronizing affection that makes me feel like a child who needs constant supervision. I want to take a moment here to thank all of you who are watching this story unfold. If you are finding comfort in my words, please consider subscribing to this channel where we share real stories from real people. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, your stories matter to me, and they matter to others who might be going through similar struggles. The morning after Garrett's passing, our house filled with casseroles and condolences. Cordelia took charge immediately, the way she always does. She's a successful lawyer, used to being in control, and she swept through the house like a tornado, organizing everything with military precision. Thaddeus, quieter but equally decisive, handled the financial arrangements and the funeral home details. "Mama, you just rest," Cordelia kept saying, patting my hand like I was a frightened bird. "We'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry about a thing." Every time I tried to voice an opinion about the service, about the flowers, about anything really, one of them would interrupt with a gentle but firm, "Mama, let us handle this. You've been through enough." But I hadn't been through enough. Not yet. The secret I'd been carrying for 20 years felt heavier than ever, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. As I watched my children plan their father's funeral, praising his character and his legacy, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach that had been my constant companion for 2 decades. You see, Garrett wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He wasn't even the man I'd married, though it took me 47 years to fully understand that. The discovery I made in his study that day 20 years ago had changed everything, but I'd never told a soul. Not my children, not my pastor, not my closest friends. I'd carried that burden alone, and it had nearly broken me. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by people who spoke about my husband in glowing terms, I felt more isolated than ever. They talked about his generosity, his integrity, his devotion to family. If only they knew. If only they could see the box of letters and documents I'd hidden away, the evidence of a life lived in deception. The first visitor that morning was Margaret Chen, our next-door neighbor for 30 years. She brought a green bean casserole and tears in her eyes. "Evie, honey, I just can't believe he is gone," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and sadness. "Garrett was such a good man. You were so blessed to have him." I nodded and smiled, the way I'd learned to do. "Yes, he was special," I managed to say, though the words felt like gravel in my throat. Pastor Williams arrived shortly after, a kind man in his 60s who'd known our family for decades. He took my hands in his and spoke about Garrett's contributions to the church, his faithful attendance, his generous spirit. He was a man of strong moral character, Pastor Williams said, his voice warm with genuine affection. The kind of husband and father we all aspire to be. I excused myself to the kitchen, claiming I needed to organize the food donations. But really, I needed to breathe. I needed to escape the chorus of praise for a man who de-lived a double life so expertly that even his own family had no idea who he really was. The kitchen counter was covered with dishes from well-meaning neighbors. Cornbread from the Hendersons, potato salad from the Johnsons, a ham from the Methodist Women's Auxiliary. Each dish came with a story about Garrett's kindness, his reliability, his steadfast character. Cordelia found me there, staring at the overwhelming display of food and condolences. "Mama, are you all right?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You look pale." "Fine, sweetheart," I lied, the same lie I'd been telling for 20 years. "Just tired." "Of course you are. Why didn't you go lie down? Thaddeus and I can handle the visitors." "I want to help plan the service," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Cordelia's expression softened into that familiar, patronizing smile. "Mama, you don't need to worry about those details. We've already spoken with Pastor Williams. Everything is arranged." "But I am his wife," I protested weakly. "You are his widow," she corrected gently. "And you are grieving. Let us take care of you." That word, widow, hit me like a physical blow. I was a widow now, free from the marriage that had defined my entire adult life. But was I really free? Or was I just trading one prison for another? One where my children would make all my decisions for me because I was too old, too fragile, too simple to handle my own life. The rest of the day passed in a blur of visitors and condolences. Garrett's business partner, Henry Morrison, came by with his wife. They talked about closing the store for the day of the funeral, about how irreplaceable Garrett had been, about what a loss this was for the entire community. "He was the most honest man I ever knew," Henry said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never cut corners, never took advantage of anyone. His word was his bond." I excused myself again, this time to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes red-rimmed from crying, but there was something else there too. Something that had been building for 20 years. Anger, not just at Garrett, but at myself for staying silent for so long. That evening, after the last visitor had gone home and Cordelia and Thaddeus had retired to their old bedrooms, I sat alone in the living room where Garrett used to read his newspaper every night. The house felt different without him, emptier, but also somehow less oppressive. I thought about the box hidden in my bedroom closet behind the winter coats that still smelled like mothballs. Inside that box were letters, photographs, legal documents, and bank statements that told a story so different from the one everyone believed. They revealed a Garrett who'd been living a double life for over 30 years, maintaining relationships and responsibilities that he had hidden from his family with careful precision. The most devastating discovery had been a birth certificate. A little girl named Morgana, born 28 years ago to a woman named Delilah in the next county over. Garrett's signature was on the birth certificate, listed as the father. There were photos of him with this woman and child, images that showed a side of my husband I'd never seen. He looked relaxed, happy, unguarded in a way he'd never been with our family. For 20 years, I'd wrestled with what to do with this knowledge. I'd prayed about it, agonized over it, lost sleep over it. Should I tell my children that their father had another daughter? Should I reveal that their hero had feet of clay? Or should I take the secret to my grave, preserving their memories of the man they'd loved? The weight of that decision had been crushing. Some days I'd convinced myself that protecting my children from the truth was the loving thing to do. Other days I'd felt like a coward for not having the courage to speak up. But as I sat in that quiet living room, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the hours, I realized that my silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only protected a lie. My faith had been my anchor through these difficult years. Every morning, I'd walk to the little white chapel on Elm Street and sit in the back pew, talking to God about my burden. I'd read scripture about forgiveness, about truth, about the courage to do what heck's right, even when it is hard. But I'd never found a clear answer, never received the divine guidance I'd been seeking. Now, with Garrett gone, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could continue to protect his reputation, allow my children to mourn the father they thought they knew, and take the secret to my grave. Or I could finally speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. The funeral was scheduled for Friday morning, 3 days to decide whether to remain the silent, obedient wife I'd been for 52 years, or to finally find my voice. 3 days to choose between protecting a dead man's reputation and honoring the truth that had been burning inside me for 2 decades. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom that night, I felt the familiar weight of the secret pressing down on my shoulders. But for the first time in 20 years, I also felt something else stirring inside me. Something that might have been courage, or might have been desperation. Either way, it was stronger than the fear that had kept me silent for so long. I paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at the living room where I'd spent so many evenings watching my husband read his paper, never suspecting the complicated web of lies he'd woven around our family. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more condolences, more praise for the man who'd deceived us all. But it would also bring me one day closer to a decision that would change everything. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as I finally made my way to bed. But sleep would not come easily. In the darkness of my bedroom, I wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. What did I owe to the truth? What did I owe to my children? Memories of their father. What did I owe to myself after a lifetime of silence? Outside my window, the October wind rustled through the maple tree that Garrett had planted the year Cordelia was born. 43 years ago, when our marriage was young and I still believed in the fairy tale of happily ever after. Now that tree was taller than our house, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky. But even the strongest trees could be uprooted by the right storm. As I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the ticking of the clock, I wondered if I had the strength to be that storm, to uproot the careful lies that had taken root in our family's story, to speak the truth that had been growing inside me like a seed in darkness, waiting for the right moment to break through the soil and reach toward the light. The next morning would bring new challenges, new visitors, new opportunities to either speak or remain silent. But whatever happened, I knew that Friday's funeral would be unlike anything our little town had ever seen. Because after 52 years of silence, Evangeline Thornfield was finally ready to find her voice. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that used to make Garrett talk about how much he loved this time of year. I woke before dawn, as I had every morning for the past 20 years, with the weight of my secret pressing against my chest like a stone. But today felt different. Today, the stone felt heavier, more urgent, as if it were demanding to be acknowledged. I dressed in my navy blue dress, the one Garrett had always said brought out my eyes, and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet, with Cordelia and Thaddeus still sleeping in their childhood rooms. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to wake them up and simply tell them everything. To sit them down at the kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals and explain that their father wasn't the man they thought he was. But the moment passed, as it always did, and I found myself making coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The routine was familiar, comforting even. 3 scoops of coffee, just the way Garrett had liked it. Old habits die hard, I suppose. The morning newspaper was already on the front porch, delivered by Jimmy Peterson's grandson, like it had been every day for the past 15 years. The front page carried Garrett's obituary, complete with a photograph from his 60th birthday party. He looked distinguished in his gray suit, his smile confident and warm. The article described him as a beloved husband, devoted father, and respected businessman who had touched countless lives in our community. Reading those words, I felt that familiar twist in my stomach. Devoted husband. The phrase seemed to mock me, reminding me of all the nights he'd claimed to be working late, all the business trips to neighboring counties, all the times he'd seemed distracted and distant. Now I knew why. Cordelia appeared in the kitchen just as I was finishing the obituary, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and her eyes puffy from sleep and tears. "Morning, Mama," she said softly, wrapping her arms around me from behind. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," I lied, the same lie I'd been telling for 20 years. "Just fine." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me at the table. Thaddeus and I were thinking we should go through Daddy S papers today. You know, get his affairs in order. My heart jumped. Garrett IS papers. The ones in his study, filed neatly in the desk where ID made my devastating discovery 2 decades ago. I'd been so careful over the years to make sure the children never went through those files, always claiming I'd handle Garrett Oz business matters myself. But now, with him gone, they'd naturally want to take care of everything. I can handle that, I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Cordelia's eyebrows rose slightly. Mama, there is no need for you to stress yourself with all those legal documents and financial papers. That's why Thaddeus and I are here. But I know where everything is, I protested, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. I'm sure you do, but some of those business contracts and tax documents can be pretty complicated. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. Thaddeus joined us then, already dressed in his dark suit and looking every inch the successful businessman he had become. He inherited Garrett's height and his way of commanding attention when he walked into a room. "Good morning, Mother," he said, kissing my cheek. "Cordelia told me you want to help with Daddy's paperwork. That is sweet of you, but we can handle it." There it was again, that patronizing tone that suggested I was a child who needed protection from the complexities of adult life. I'd heard it so many times over the years that I'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. "I've been handling your father Wes' business matters for years," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, yes, but mostly just the household bills and things like that," Thaddeus said with a gentle smile. "The business contracts and legal documents are a different matter entirely." I wanted to laugh or maybe scream. If only they knew that I'd been the one balancing the books, managing the investments, and keeping track of every penny for the past decade. Garrett had been brilliant at making money, but terrible at managing it. He'd relied on me more than they could possibly imagine, though he'd never given me credit for any of it. "Maybe we should start with the study," Cordelia suggested. "Get all the important papers organized first." My blood ran cold. The study, where the box of secrets sat hidden behind a loose board in the bottom drawer of Garrett's desk. The box ID discovered 20 years ago and had been too afraid to fully explore until recently. "I'll help," I said, standing up so quickly that my chair scraped against the floor. "Mama? Really, you don't need to—" "I want to help," I interrupted more firmly than I'd spoken to my children in years. They exchanged a look, the kind of look that parents give each other when their child is having a tantrum. It was a look I'd seen countless times, and it never failed to make me feel small and insignificant. "All right," Cordelia said finally. "But if it gets too overwhelming, you'll let us know, won't you?" I nodded, but inside I was calculating. I had to get to that box before they did. I had to decide, once and for all, what I was going to do with the truth that had been eating me alive for 2 decades. We spent the morning going through the obvious paperwork. Insurance policies, the deed to the house, bank statements, business licenses. All the documentation of a life lived in full view of the community. But I kept watching the bottom drawer of Garrett's desk, knowing that the real story of our marriage lay hidden there. Around noon, visitors began arriving again. More casseroles, more condolences, more stories about Garrett's generosity and character. I found myself listening to these stories with new ears, wondering how many of these people had benefited from money that rightfully belonged to his other family. Mrs. Abernathy from the library talked about the books Garrett had donated every Christmas. "He always said education was the most important gift you could give a child," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Such a devoted family man. Devoted family man." There were those words again, cutting through me like a knife. Pastor Williams stopped by in the afternoon to discuss the funeral service. He sat in Garrett's favorite chair, his Bible open on his lap, talking about the scripture readings and hymns we'd chosen. "I could like to say a few words about Garrett's character," he said to Cordelia and Thaddeus. "Perhaps you could share some memories that illustrate the kind of man he was?" Thaddeus leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, Pastor, there are so many stories. Remember when the Anderson family lost their house in that fire? Daddy organized the whole rebuilding effort, even paid for most of the materials himself. And he never wanted any recognition for it," Cordelia added. "He always said that helping people was just what you did, not something you bragged about." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. That was the Garrett I knew. Always putting others first, always thinking about his family and his community. I excused myself to the kitchen, claiming I needed to prepare more coffee. But really, I needed to escape the growing monument of praise being built around a man who lived a lie for over 30 years. In the quiet of the kitchen, I pressed my hands against the counter and tried to steady my breathing. That S when I heard the soft knock at the back door. I looked up to see a woman standing on my porch, young and pretty with dark hair and nervous eyes. She was holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who looked remarkably familiar. My heart stopped. I knew who this was before she even spoke. "Mrs. Thornfield?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry to bother you, especially now, but I needed to see you." I opened the door with trembling hands, stepping out onto the porch and closing it behind me. I didn't want Cordelia and Thaddeus to see this woman, not yet, maybe not ever. "You are Morgana," I said, and it wasn't a question. She nodded, tears starting to fall. "I know this is a terrible time, but I had to come. I had to see where Daddy lived." Daddy. The word hit me like a physical blow. This beautiful young woman was calling my husband Daddy, and the little boy beside her had Garrett S.'s eyes and his stubborn chin. "This is my son Caleb," she continued, her voice breaking. "He is 8. He never got to meet his grandfather, but I told him stories about Daddy, about how he used to take me fishing and help me with my homework." I stared at this woman who represented everything I'd tried to ignore for 20 years. She was real, standing on my back porch, grieving for the same man I was supposed to be mourning. But her grief was different from mine, cleaner somehow, uncompounded by the weight of deception. "I know you know about me," she said quietly. "Mama told me that Daddy said you'd have found some of his letters years ago. I've been waiting for you to contact me to maybe meet, but I never did," I finished for her. She nodded. "I understand. It must have been hard for you, knowing about us. But I wanted you to know that Daddy loved you. He talked about you all the time, about how proud he was of Cordelia and Thaddeus, about how much he respected you." Respected me. I wanted to laugh bitterly. If he'd respected me, he wouldn't have put me in this impossible position. He wouldn't have forced me to carry the weight of his secrets while he played the devoted husband and father to 2 different families. "Are you coming to the funeral?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Morgana's face crumpled. "I do not know. I want to say goodbye, but I do not want to cause any trouble. Mama said I should stay away, that it would be too hard on everyone. But he was my father too, Mrs. Thornfield. He was the only Daddy I ever knew." I looked at this young woman, so much like Cordelia in her mannerisms, but with features that were entirely her own. She had Garrett's nose and his way of tilting her head when she was thinking. And little Caleb, with his serious eyes and quiet demeanor, could have been Thaddeus at that age. "Where is your mother now?" I asked. "She passed away 3 years ago," Morgana said, wiping her eyes. "Cancer. Daddy was with her at the end. He held her hand and told her he was sorry he couldn't to give her more than he did, but she said she understood. She said she'd always known that his heart was split between 2 families. Split between 2 families. Is that what Garrett had told himself? That he could love us all equally, just separately? Did he think that made it better somehow? "I should go," Morgana said, stepping back toward the porch steps. "I'm sorry for bothering you. I needed to see you, to thank you." "Thank me?" I was confused. "For sharing him with us. Mama always said that you were the bigger person, that you let Daddy be part of our lives, even though it must have hurt you." She said that took real strength. I almost laughed at the irony. Delilah had thought my silence was generosity, when really it had been cowardice. She'd seen my inability to confront the truth as some kind of noble sacrifice. "Morgana!" I called as she reached the bottom of the steps. "What would you do if you were me?" She turned back, considering the question seriously. I think I'd want people to know the truth, not to hurt anyone, but because lies are heavy things to carry, and because Caleb has the right to know his cousins, doesn't he? They were family too. Family. The word hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. After they left, I stood on the back porch for a long time, watching the sun sink lower in the October sky. Inside, I could hear Cordelia and Thaddeus talking with Pastor Williams, planning a funeral service that would celebrate a man who'd never really existed. At least, not in the way they believed. When I finally went back inside, Cordelia looked at me with concern. "Mama, you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," I said, the eternal lie. "Why don't you rest before dinner? Thaddeus and I can handle things here." I nodded and made my way upstairs to my bedroom. But instead of lying down, I went to my closet and pulled out the box I'd hidden behind the winter coats. The box that contained the evidence of Garrett S. double life. I'd looked through it countless times over the years, but never with the intention of doing anything about it. Tonight felt different. Tonight, I opened it with the weight of Morgana I.'s words echoing in my mind. Lies are heavy things to carry. There were letters from Delilah, some dating back 35 years. Love letters that spoke of a passion and intimacy that I'd never experienced with Garrett. There were photographs of him with Morgana at various ages, pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and ordinary moments that should have been shared with our family. There were bank statements showing regular payments to Delilah for Morgana's support. Money that had come from our family business, money that could have paid for Cordelia's graduate school or Thaddeus' first house. Instead, it had gone to support a secret family that we'd never been told about. But the most damning evidence was a legal document from 5 years ago. Garrett had set up a trust fund for Morgana, ensuring that she would inherit a substantial portion of his estate. A portion that would have to come from what Cordelia and Thaddeus thought was rightfully theirs. I sat on my bed, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. How do you pray for guidance when every option seems wrong? How do you ask God for wisdom when you've been complicit in a lie for 20 years? The house grew quiet as evening settled over Millbrook. Downstairs, Cordelia and Thaddeus were probably sharing memories of their father, talking about the funny things he used to say and the lessons he'd taught them. They were building a monument to a man who'd never existed, at least not in the pure form they remembered. Tomorrow would be Thursday, the day before the funeral. One more day to decide whether to let them bury their father with his secrets intact or to speak the truth that would shatter their world but might also set us all free. I thought about Morgana's words again. Lies are heavy things to carry. I'd been carrying this particular lie for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. But tomorrow, I would have to choose. Silence or truth, comfort or courage. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I finally put the box away and prepared for bed. But sleep would not come easily again. In the darkness, I wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, knowing that whatever I decided would change everything for everyone I loved. Friday morning was coming, whether I was ready or not, and with it, the moment when I would finally have to choose between the woman I'd been and the woman I might still become. Thursday arrived with the kind of gray sky that seemed to press down on our little town like a heavy blanket. I woke before dawn again, but this time I didn't go through the motions of making coffee or reading the newspaper. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the closet where the box of secrets waited, knowing that today would be the last day I could remain silent. The house was already stirring when I finally made my way downstairs. Cordelia was in the kitchen, talking quietly on her phone with someone about flower arrangements. Thaddeus was in the living room, adjusting his tie and looking every inch the successful son preparing to honor his father's memory. "Morning, Mama," Cordelia said when she saw me, covering the phone with her hand. "I am just confirming the final details with the funeral home. Everything is going to be beautiful. Beautiful." The word felt hollow in my chest. How could anything be beautiful when it was built on a foundation of lies? "Cordelia," I said, and something in my voice made her end her phone call immediately. "What is it, Mama? You look different." I did feel different. Something had shifted during the night, some internal switch that had flipped from decades of silence to a growing certainty that I couldn't to live with this secret anymore. Not when Morgana was out there, grieving alone. Not when Caleb would grow up never knowing his grandfather's true family. Not when my own children were about to bury a myth instead of the complicated, flawed man their father had actually been. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Both of you, before the funeral. Thaddeus appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension in the room. "What is wrong, Mother?" I looked at my children, these two adults who still treated me like a fragile ornament, and felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years. Determination. Maybe even a touch of anger at the years I'd wasted being the quiet, obedient wife who never rocked the boat. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the kitchen table where we shared so many meals as a family. "Please." They exchanged that look again, the one that said they were humoring their elderly mother, but they sat down anyway. Cordelia reached across the table and took my hand, her expression soft with concern. "Whatever it is, Mama, we'll handle it together," she said gently. If only she knew what she was promising. I took a deep breath, drawing on a strength I wasn't sure I possessed. "Your father wasn't the man you think he was." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my children's faces change as they tried to process what I'd just said. "What do you mean?" Thaddeus asked, his voice careful. "I mean that for over 30 years, your father lived a double life. He had another family, another daughter, in the next county, and I've known about it for 20 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia's hand went slack in mine, and Thaddeus leaned back in his chair as if I'd physically pushed him. That's impossible," Cordelia whispered. "Daddy would never. He loved us. He loved you." "He did love us," I said, "and I meant it. But he loved them too. Her name is Morgana, and she's 28 years old. She has a son named Caleb, who's 8. They both have your father's eyes." Thaddeus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "And this is grief talking, Mother. You are not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 20 years, I said, rising to meet his gaze. "And I can prove everything I am telling you." I left them sitting there, stunned and confused, while I went upstairs to retrieve the box. My hands were shaking as I carried it down to the kitchen, but there was also a strange sense of relief. After 2 decades of carrying this burden alone, I was finally sharing it. "What is that?" Cordelia asked, staring at the box as if it might contain a snake. "The truth," I said simply, and began laying out the evidence on our kitchen table. The letters came first. Delilah's flowing handwriting expressing love and longing and gratitude for the life Garrett had given her and their daughter. Then the photographs, dozens of them, showing Garrett at Morgana's birthday parties, at her high school graduation, holding baby Caleb in the hospital. Cordelia picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It showed Garrett pushing a young Morgana on a swing, both of them laughing. He looked happy in a way that I realized I'd rarely seen him with our family. "When did you find these?" Thaddeus asked, his voice hollow. 20 years ago. I was looking for the insurance papers after your father had that minor heart episode, and I found them in a hidden compartment in his desk. I've been carrying this secret ever since." 20 years? Cordelia's voice cracked. "You've been known for 20 years and never told us?" "I didn't know how," I admitted. "I kept thinking about how much it would hurt you both, how it would change everything you believed about your father. I thought maybe it would be kinder to let you keep your memories intact." "Kinder?" Thaddeus' voice was rising. "You thought it would be kinder to let us live a lie, and I thought it would be kinder than destroying your faith in the man who raised you." I shot back, and for the first time in decades, I felt fire in my voice. "I thought it would be kinder than watching you realize that half of your inheritance was going to a daughter you had never met." I pulled out the legal documents, the trust fund papers that showed Morgana's claim to Garrett's estate. Cordelia read them with the careful attention of the lawyer she was, and I watched her face grow pale. "She gets 40%, Cordelia whispered. 40% of everything. Everything he told you was yours, I confirmed. The house, the business, the savings accounts, all of it will have to be divided with a woman you've never met." Thaddeus sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "This can to be happening. Not today. Not when we were supposed to be burying him." That's exactly why it has to happen today," I said, surprised by my own conviction. "Because in 2 hours, Pastor Williams is going to stand up in that church and talk about your father's character and integrity. And everyone in town is going to nod along and remember him as the perfect husband and father. And it is not true." "So what?" Cordelia exploded. "So what if it is not true? He is dead, Mama. What does it matter now? Thus it matters because Morgana is alive, I said quietly. And so is Caleb. And they re-grieving too, but they can't even come to the funeral because they re-afraid of causing trouble. It matters because they re-family, whether we like it or not. I told them about Morgana's visit the day before, about her quiet dignity and her son's serious eyes. I told them about Delilah's final words, about how she'd thought my silence was generosity when it was really cowardice. She was coming to the funeral, I said finally. Morgana, she was going to sit in the back and grieve silently while the rest of us pretend she doesn't exist. And I can to do that anymore. What are you saying? Thaddeus asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew. I am saying that I am going to tell the truth, today, at the funeral. The explosion that followed was everything I had expected, and more. Cordelia accused me of losing my mind, of being cruel and vindictive. Thaddeus suggested we postpone the funeral, give everyone time to process this information. They begged me to reconsider, to think about the family's reputation, to consider the impact on the community. But for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't listening to their voices. I was listening to my own, the voice that had been silenced for so long that I'd almost forgotten it existed. I've made my decision, I said when they finally stopped arguing. I am going to speak at the funeral, and I am going to tell the truth about your father. All of it. Mama, please, Cordelia begged. Think about what you were doing. Think about how this will hurt people. I am thinking about it, I said. And I am thinking about how keeping this secret has hurt me for 20 years. How it has hurt Morgana and Caleb, who have to grieve in shadows. How it has hurt all of us by building our family on a foundation of lies. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of tension and tears. Cordelia and Thaddeus alternated between anger and pleading, trying every argument they could think of to change my mind. But my resolve only grew stronger. I dressed carefully in my black dress, the one I'd worn to Garrett's mother's funeral years ago, and pinned the brooch he had given me on our 25th anniversary to my lapel. You can do this, Cordelia said one final time as we prepared to leave for the church. It's not fair to Daddy's memory. What's not fair, I said, meeting her eyes in the mirror, is that I've spent 20 years protecting a memory that was never real in the first place. The First Baptist Church was packed when we arrived. It seemed like the entire town had come to pay their respects to Garrett Thornfield, the man they all thought they knew. I sat in the front pew between my children, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, the widow who was supposed to be quietly grieving. Pastor Williams began the service with a reading from Psalms, his voice echoing through the church as he spoke about God's comfort in times of loss. The choir sang Amazing Grace, Garrett's favorite hymn, and I found myself thinking about the words, about being lost and then found, about seeing clearly for the first time. Then came the eulogies. Henry Morrison spoke about Garrett's business ethics and his contributions to the community. Cordelia's voice shook as she talked about her father's guidance and support throughout her life. Thaddeus shared memories of fishing trips and baseball games, of the father who'd taught him to be a man. As I listened to their words, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. They weren't lying when they spoke about Garrett's love for his family. He had loved us, in his way. But love and honesty aren't the same thing, and I'd finally learned the difference. I scanned the congregation during the eulogies, looking for Morgana. I found her in the very back, sitting alone with little Caleb beside her. She was crying quietly, her hand over her mouth as if she were trying to hold back sobs. Our eyes met across the crowded church, and I saw something in her expression that gave me courage. Hope, maybe. Or just the recognition that someone finally saw her. And now, Pastor Williams said, Evie Thornfield would like to say a few words about her husband. The church fell silent. In 52 years of marriage, I'd never spoken publicly about Garrett. Everyone expected me to decline, to remain in my seat and let others speak for me. But I stood up, my legs steadier than I'd expected, and walked to the podium. Looking out at the sea of faces, I saw friends and neighbors who'd known our family for decades. People who'd bought hardware from Garrett's store, who'd served on committees with him, who'd watched him coach Little League and organize charity drives. They were all waiting to hear the grieving widow confirm what they already believed about the man in the casket. 52 years, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the church. That is how long I was married to Garrett Thornfield. 52 years of sharing a life, a home, a family. And for most of those years, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. I paused, looking directly at Cordelia and Thaddeus. Their faces were pale with dread, but also something else. Maybe it was relief that the pretending was finally over. Garrett was a complicated man, I continued. He was generous with his community, devoted to his business, and he loved his family deeply. But he was also a man who carried secrets, who made choices that affected more people than just himself. The congregation was completely silent now, sensing that something unexpected was happening. I could feel the tension in the room, the collective holding of breath. 20 years ago, I discovered that Garrett had been living a double life. He had another family, another daughter, in the next county. Her name is Morgana, and she's here today, grieving for the father she loved just as much as Cordelia and Thaddeus loved theirs. The gasp that went through the church was audible. I saw people turning to look at each other, saw Morgana's face crumple as hundreds of eyes found her in the back pew. I've kept this secret for 20 years, I said, my voice growing stronger. I thought I was protecting my children, protecting Garrett's reputation, protecting our family, as place in this community. But I was wrong. Secrets don't protect anyone. They just create more pain, more isolation, more loneliness. I looked directly at Morgana, who was staring at me with tears streaming down her face. Morgana, would you please come forward? I think it is time our family met. The church erupted in whispers, but Morgana stood up slowly, taking Caleb's hand. They walked down the aisle together, and I watched as people noticed the unmistakable resemblance between the little boy and the man in the casket. When they reached the front, I took Morgana's other hand and faced the congregation together. Garrett wasn't a perfect man, I said. He made choices that caused pain and confusion. But he was also a man who loved deeply, even if he didn't always love wisely. Morgana is proof of that love. She is not a scandal or a shame. She is family, and she has every right to grieve here with us. I turned to face Garrett and's casket, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Garrett, I said, speaking directly to the man who shared my life for over 5 decades. I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, but because carrying anger and resentment for 20 years has been harder on me than it ever was on you. I forgive you because forgiveness isn't about you anymore. It is about me finally being free. The silence in the church was profound. I could hear people crying, could feel the shock and confusion radiating from the congregation. But I also felt something else, peace. For the first time in 20 years, I felt completely at peace. I know this is hard to understand, I said, addressing the congregation one final time. I know it changes how you see Garrett, how you see our family, but the truth is that families are complicated things. They were built on love and disappointment, on joy and secrets, on the 1,000 small choices we make every day about how to treat each other. I looked at Cordelia and Thaddeus, who were sitting in stunned silence. My children, I'm sorry I kept this from you for so long. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. I was afraid of your anger, afraid of losing the respect you had for your father, afraid of admitting that I'd been complicit in a lie for 20 years. I turned to Morgana, who was still crying but no longer hiding her tears. And Morgana, I am sorry I waited so long to acknowledge you. You deserved better than shadows and secrets. You deserved a grandmother who welcomed you, siblings who knew you existed, a place in this family that was rightfully yours. The funeral continued after that, but it was different. Pastor Williams, to his credit, adjusted his closing remarks to acknowledge the complexity of human nature and the importance of truth and forgiveness. The burial was smaller, with only family and close friends. But Morgana was there, standing with us as we said goodbye to the man who had been father to us all. In the days that followed, there was gossip and speculation, as there always is in small towns. Some people were scandalized, others were sympathetic. The store had to be closed temporarily while the estate was sorted out, and there were legal complications that would take months to resolve. But there was also something else: healing. Cordelia and Thaddeus, after the initial shock, began to build a relationship with their half-sister. Morgana moved closer to town, and little Caleb started spending weekends with his newfound cousins. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension and awkwardness, but families have survived worse. As for me, I found something I'd lost decades ago: my voice. The experience of standing up in that church and speaking my truth, regardless of the consequences, had awakened something in me that I'd thought was gone forever. I started attending town council meetings, sharing my opinions about local issues. I joined the library board and the historical society. I even started writing, recording stories about our family's real history for future generations. People in town began to see me differently, not as the quiet widow who needed protection, but as a woman with opinions and experiences worth hearing. It was strange, being seen as a person rather than just a role, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. 6 months after the funeral, I was sitting in my kitchen with Morgana and Caleb, helping him with his homework while she made dinner. It was a Thursday evening, quiet and ordinary, and I realized that this was what family actually looked like. Not perfect, not without complications, but real, honest, built on truth instead of carefully maintained illusions. "Grandma Evie," Caleb said, looking up from his math worksheet. "Can you tell me another story about Grandpa Garrett?" I smiled, looking at this little boy who had his grandfather's eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. "Which story would you like to hear?" "The one about the fishing trip," he said. "But the real one this time. The real one." I'd been telling Caleb the sanitized versions of Garrett's stories, the ones that painted him as a perfect grandfather. But lately, I'd been sharing the more complex stories, the ones that showed him as a flawed but loving man who'd made both good and bad choices. "Well," I said, settling back in my chair, "your grandfather loved to fish, but he was terrible at it. He'd get so frustrated when the fish wouldn't bite that he'd start talking to them, trying to negotiate." As I told the story, I felt that familiar sense of peace wash over me. This was what truth felt like: messy, complicated, sometimes painful, but ultimately freeing. I'd spent 20 years protecting a lie, and in doing so, I'd nearly lost myself. But in choosing to speak the truth, I'd found not just my voice, but my family. The real one, complete with all its imperfections and complications. Outside, the Tennessee sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of sunset that Garrett had always loved, the kind that made him talk about how beautiful life could be if you just took the time to notice it. He'd been right about that, even if he'd been wrong about so many other things. Life was beautiful, but only when you lived it honestly. Only when you stopped hiding behind the stories you thought people wanted to hear and started telling the truth about who you really were. I was 78 years old, and I was finally learning how to live. Not the life I thought I was supposed to have, but the life that was actually mine. Complicated, imperfect, but undeniably real. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful thing of all.